Someone shines a light into my dark wizard matter. A way to unclose the circuit of magic, madness, and sadness.
That's right. MMS runs through all magic users. I hung out with scores of them, all displaying varying degrees of magic, madness, and sadness.
So goes the chant that resonates throughout all fiction, fantasy, and the real world. The association of power and knowledge is inextricably linked to insanity and isolation. This is something we unconsciously abide by, either when discussing how absolute power corrupts absolutely, or intentionally, as in the case of Lovecraft's world, where knowledge leads to madness, and madness leads to the unbearable and incomprehensible truth, and there is no end to the truth. This trope, summarized simply by the catchy magic, madness, and sadness from Adventure Time, is more than a trope or even a motif. This is an archetype, which you can think of as classifying a deeply rooted subconscious ideation, something as fundamental to our psyche as emotions and language. This concept of power and corruption in direct relation and causation, the archetype of corruption. Let's go through some examples. In the popular fantasy epic, The Wheel of Time is centered around this insanity that accompanies each use of the magic of that world. Women are not affected by this insanity in The Wheel of Time, which, as we will see, is actually true to the archetype. It expresses itself differently in men and women. As mentioned, there is Lovecraft's madness. In Harry Potter, we see Voldemort's quest for power corrupt him into a fiend that sought only more and more power, sacrificing his humanity for the dark arts. Dumbledore actually falls into this archetype as well. It is not strictly evil, but more of an aloofness that can either be good or bad. Even Dumbledore was considered crazy by the Wizard Council. There is a separateness about power. It isolates and removes you from the cultural and societal bond. The community ostracizes and fears you because they do not understand. They recognize you as something alien and foreign. In Star Wars, the pursuit of the strongest Force abilities lead to the dark side. In Lord of the Rings, the actual rings corrupt the user, as we saw with Gollum, and at times with Frodo, or even in becoming this sort of essence of evil like Sauron. And much like Dumbledore, Gandalf is a being alone who understands his balance teeters between sanity and power, something his counterpart Saruman succumbs to. In Arthurian lore, Merlin and Morgan Le Fay represent two sides of that power struggle and fighting off the madness. Morgan Le Fay chooses to pursue the power that even Merlin didn't dare touch, and from that she became a corrupted version of herself. In the portrait of Dorian Gray, this same temptation and delve into evil occurs in relation to the power he wields. In the Mistborn trilogy, the Lord Ruler found a way to have unlimited power and suffered from the same isolation and insanity we can expect in fantasy, where the characters constantly struggling to balance power use and corruption. This archetype is so prevalent in the genre of fantasy and sci-fi. The most tropey shows often use a discombobulated, amorphous entity of pure corruption that dams the lands and swallows the purity of usually some sort of king or powerful wizard or hero. It is most often someone who is already in a position of power that becomes a vessel for this corruption to start. For this corruption to start to spread, coming in on a meteor, an ancient dormant curse, a spell cast from an evil sorcerer, or some locked away evil entity. They are some of the popular plot devices. In sci-fi, this is usually an unknown alien species that threatens the galaxy. Sometimes it is like a reoccurring alien species cataclysm that other older galactic empires had to fight, and what ultimately brought about their ruin. The main takeaway is that this alien or evil curse is hyper-intelligent, sentient, and otherworldly, infesting the mind of the host and increasing their powers. So we have a few different expressions of this madness and magic archetype. There is the direct evil entity that corrupts and offers power. There is the more insanity-driven magic where knowledge is directly related to power. And then you have the more simple power and knowledge that lead to corruption over time. In the above example I just talked about, most of those characters were men. Men in this archetypal node are attracted to the power. It calls to them and shows how they can externalize that power by conquest and war. The trend for men in this is all about gathering power and dominating with that. It's an endless quest for infinite power and ultimately a drive to reach godhood. The male wizard or sorcerer trope, that sort of larger-than-life character of purity and nobility and virtue, is able to draw the line and stop that maddening search for power, where Dumbledore and Voldemort differ, or Gandalf and Saruman, is their awareness of their own sanity and what happens when that is taken too far. But they are both expressions of the same archetype. Good and evil are directly related to the level of madness and insanity. Even if they are still slightly insane or aloof, it is the quest for that power that tends to cause the corruption. The willingness to sacrifice everything in that pursuit, foregoing even their own humanity. As a species, we despise anyone who denies their human heritage or allegiance to the idea of human. They are always represented as evil. Anytime there is a war between multiple races of creature or alien, the human that changes sides is always seen as the worst traitor, the lowest of scum. This pro-humanism ideology disappears when either the corruption or the knowledge reaches a high enough point. In the case of the aloof old wizard, they are often neutral, requiring convincing to join the cause against evil. In David Gemmell's Draenei saga, there were magical weapons that subtly took over and influenced the wielder over the course of their life to have a twisted relationship with the magical weapon. It made them always seek blood and violence. Themes of a young and idealistic boy king fighting to save his empire and then succumbing to the corruption and tyranny are prevalent in Gemmell's work, showing how the role of a leader can turn even the most kind-hearted people cruel, and often they have one of those cursed items that helps them early on in their reconquest. As we see time and time again, these themes reverberate throughout the very unconscious. Entire stories are structured around this principle of power and corruption. So how does it commonly express itself in women? If in men the corruption leads to an endless external quest for either power, knowledge, or domination, in women it leads to an internal strife for perfection, absolutism, and manipulation. To understand this, let us explore more iterations of this archetype in women. In the bell jar, Esther's spiral of insanity is proportional to her understanding of culture and her unwillingness to participate in society, recognizing the unfairness and inanity of the whole thing. This mental breakdown of hers only furthers her ostracization, but eventually when she copes with her life and returns to society, perhaps more numb than before, her mind calms down. That internal struggle for absolutism ultimately led to Esther's psychotic break, which she had to consciously decide she was going to forget about. Society, in general, has created a special type of building to house anyone who doesn't fit in, asylums and mental hospitals. The exploration of waking up to the craziness of society puts you into a mental ward. In the web serial Worm, tapping into the shard's power slowly made Taylor go insane, taking revenge for her early life of trauma and being bullied when she used the newfound power, with insanity following closely behind. In Tolstoy's masterful drama, Anna Karenina, Anna sees through the lies of society and her peers during the height of her breakdown. In woman, this archetype is intense and magnetizing. People are drawn to this, like a star in which the world around them orbits. They are both aware of this gravitational force and use it to their advantage. Of course, there is also the witch queen trope, like Maleficent, the Wicked Witch of the West, or the Ice Queen from Narnia, or again, Morgan Le Fay. This leads us to another important aspect of this archetype. Its expression is twofold. In men, they can have the male version or the female version, which expresses itself through the anima of a male, and in woman, the animus. The witch or witch queen trope have a strong animus archetype. This gives us the magicker trope, like Maleficent, the Ice Queen, the Wicked Witch of the West, and Morgan Le Fay. In these cases, they are driven to conquest and tyranny like the male version, but still retain that personal, internal motivation of self-perfection and manipulation. To see the anima archetype in men, you actually see this in flawed male characters, often protagonists in animated shows. The reason this is the case is to illustrate the internal strife of overcoming their own nature to dominate those around them. A blend of the male aspect and the female aspect in men is required to achieve this. You have BoJack Horseman, a high, socially aware character who is constantly using and hurting people in his personal struggle for perfection. He thinks and lives in absolutes and manipulates those around him. And like the anima expression of the magicker archetype, he is the center of so many people's lives. In more fantasy settings, this archetype is highlighted by the setting of monstrous, underground humanoid cultures and the dynamic of the regular world that fears and despises them. These characters are caught in the middle of that struggle between two worlds, battling the corruption that threatens their humanity while they struggle to figure out who they are. These are Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul, Edward from Twilight, Shinji from Parasite the Maxim. This is actually a very common setting now, and a trope or genre in its own right. But all these male characters are perfect examples of the anima archetype expression in males. They have a soft-spoken nature, self-deprecating or self-hatred, and fighting to control that inner corruption, and ultimately trying to be a bridge between worlds. It is very much like the half-breed motif. Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender is another case of this. As to the connection to the spiritual world, Aang struggles to choose between his duty as the Avatar and his own humanity, with the full power of the Avatar threatening to take over his mind, leading him to moments of extreme violence. As I said, this anima archetype is most common in animated storytelling mediums, while the pure male archetype is common in fiction and sci-fi and fantasy, which were the first examples. The pure female archetype is your dramas with fatalism as a strong theme. The female animus archetype, like the witch, is seen in a blend of all the above. The story has to be built around a female magicker antagonist for it to make sense in the female animus archetype. Even as the antagonist, they are still the centerpiece of gravity in the story. But all of these are just storytelling and fiction. The archetype being so deeply unconscious is a real-world phenotype. And so if you've made it this far, you might have a couple questions. Before we get into what this looks like in the real world, You should know this is not a typical sort of archetype. It's not an archetype by the traditional definition. It's more like a non-human archetype. It's not necessarily something you are born into or grow into. It sort of happens. Though it is true you can pursue it if you know what you're doing. It's a meta-archetype of a non-human thing. We'll talk in a moment about what that thing is. But let's see this in real people from history. As you may have expected, it is the people deep into the occult, ancient shamans, witches, kings and emperors, magi and sorcerers, wise men, and hermits. Think of the decline of Egypt and Rome as the pharaohs and emperors became more and more crazy the sicker they grew, or just dictators and how their pursuit of power leads them to tyranny and corruption. When you mention the occult, some names may come to mind. Rasputin, Aleister Crowley, John Dee, Count Saint Germain, Hermes Trismegistus, Solomon, Pythagoras, Zhang Zhao, Zhuge Liang, Zoroaster, Nicholas Flamel, Abe no Saime, Nostradamus, Paracelsus, Robert Flood, Isaac Newton, Nikola Tesla, Marie Laveau. Now, some of these people may not have even existed, but the fact that they are surrounded by unexplainable phenomena in our world is interesting and may be an indication of this archetype. More on this in a moment. These people were mainly inventors, researchers, occultists, or alchemists. I could list just as many authors, artists, and musicians from throughout history. Now, just because you are a famous or successful artist does not mean this archetype applies to you. However, we can see this archetype expressed in the crazy and sick people. Let's talk about art and music. They say beauty is pain, they say art is torment, and they say music is suffering. Why is it that we enjoy the work of the most damaged people? It is simply the best to us. They are the most creative, the most insightful, perhaps the most rebellious or aggressive. They find words for emotions and feelings that they can invoke better than any of their peers. What's interesting is rap is often self-aware of this. Often your reputation and clout is entirely dependent upon how difficult your life is or how badly you grew up. I don't think it's a fetish for struggle. It's an unconscious and sometimes conscious acknowledgement that you are simply better for having struggled and suffered. And this is that archetype. It doesn't really follow the normal definition. It can be observed in varying degrees. It can come and go in different people. A good example of this may be a band that's first 2 albums are amazing and genre-defining. But then when they get famous and they have money and security, their music loses its quality of depth and awe. Not to say no author or artist is famous without having gone through anything. In fact, many of them have had perfectly okay lives, and that's fine. But for this purpose, we're just looking for these individuals. Let us list some artists that exhibit signs of this archetype, either through sickness or interest in the pursuit of knowledge. David Bowie, Kanye West, Van Gogh, Frida Kahlo, Da Vinci, Yayoi Kusama, Zdzislaw Beksinski, Mozart. We spoke of The Bell Jar, which is written by Sylvia Plath, and that book was mainly biographical, and her life was very tormented. These people, and there are hundreds more you could list, but they're able to create unique works and appear to have an otherworldly perspective and presence and quality to them. That is what we are trying to define and describe. This can be seen in physical appearance too. It's not only just creative or inventive outlets. There's a physical manifestation. Robert Greene, in his book Mastery, touched on this subject about how conflict and strife can help you grow, and almost touched on this subject directly again in a couple examples. He talked about Buckminster Fuller, who experienced failure after failure in trying to invent new revolutionary ideas on architecture. It grew to the point where he had no money and decided to end his life by drowning in a lake and let his family claim the insurance. Before jumping, a powerful voice spoke to him, something entirely invisible, like a voice from within that was not his own. He assessed his life after that and kept working at his new methods and eventually found success and became one of the most famous American architects. Mastery talks about something similar in another account of a man named Évariste Galois. He was a French student of mathematics and a prodigy in algebra. This was around the 1820s and 30s. And he was 20 years old when he got into a fight over a girl, and he was challenged to a duel. Galois was certain he would die in the duel. Maybe his opponent was more skilled or athletic than him, but Galois had thought he would die and decided to spend the night before trying to write down all his mathematical ideas. The next day comes, and surely enough, he is killed in the duel. After some years go by, his notes were read and published, and it revolutionized mathematics. His ideas were so far beyond his time. We hear that from a lot of these people. Ahead of their time, revolutionary, groundbreaking, genre-defining. They possess an aptitude head and shoulders above the rest. Those two examples from Mastery are not quite the typical archetype expression. The near-death experience is related, but it would be misleading to cite that as a primary function of the archetype. What we are really looking for is sickness and power, madness and magic. Think of the severely mentally retarded individuals who are geniuses at computers, logic, math, and memory. They are often savants at a particular subject. Even people you might encounter in your everyday life, people with mental issues or chronic illnesses, how insightful, creative, and unique they are. Why do you think dying people suddenly see through all the lies, deceit, and fakeness? You could say they have nothing to lose anymore, confronted with their own mortality. Which is true, but they gain insight and elucidation, and then they magnetize everyone around. People are drawn to the sick person, at first anyways. Everyone leaves the hospital with a new perspective on life. All the little things are forgotten because of this newfound approach. It is like a wake-up call. This trope of suffering and wisdom you can find in your own life, or any TV show, or movie, or book, or music, and art. You can say everyone has this archetype to some degree, though I don't think that is quite true. I think there is a specific defining factor that is required beyond just plain suffering or any struggle. There's something else going on. There needs to be damage. That corruptive force we talked about at the beginning needs to be present and real. The good and evil need to polarize to the point where the person in question is unpredictable. They struggle with wanting to dive into power at the cost of corruption, or suppressing the temptation for the sake of preserving their humanity. It is the corruption, the evil, the darkness, that distance from humanness that define this archetype. Hopefully you understand this archetype a bit now. The examples, maybe they are not all right. And you might have better examples. I certainly haven't read or seen everything, only go off of what I've been exposed to and learned about. But hopefully it is sufficient for the purposes of explaining this. Because now we can look at this archetype, which is not a human archetype, but a fungal archetype. You see, the corruption is fungus. That possession is fungus. The darkness as well. That evil entity that's always used as the villain is a subconscious expression of fungus. The hero, the wizard, the witch, they get infected by some fungal entity, a fungal growth that spreads, corrupts people, animals, and nature itself. This corruption can hit anything, and it takes over, controls it like a parasite, and then gives out powers and abilities beyond their own. What's happening in the real world with this is certain fungal infections can connect you to a fungal consciousness or database. Defining it is difficult, but humans have been giving it names for many years. They will say enlightenment, higher consciousness, kundalini awakening, third eye opening, accessing the Akashic records, Christ consciousness, transcendence, apotheosis, perhaps even ego death. All human culture has recognized the state of being that expands the mind to a god or divine realm. It taps into a source non-human, and you can draw from that. There is an evil version of this, but they are in fact the same thing, just different degrees of it, different types of fungus, different levels of infection. We've separated corruption and demons from angels and gods, but it's all fungi in variety. Demonology, occultism, magic, these are all real practices going back thousands of years. They are, of course, the basis for our fictional version of these. But people have spent lifetimes studying this and delving into it and going mad from it or becoming powerful. What they studied, what they invoked was fungus and the fungal consciousness network, and you can learn things from that. And there are entities, fungal entities, personalities, if you will, that exist as fungi on this sort of dimension. At least you are able to communicate and learn and experience them on the dimension of that fungal consciousness. They are not just blank species with some metaphysical knowledge, but they are individual organism entities of their own. Like how you would think of a demon. It has a name and a specialty in knowledge and function, and it also has its own defined illnesses. This is what demonology is about, communicating and learning from those demons. Occultism is learning the truth through that fungal network. People just have not realized that it was in fungi where darkness and corruption come from. That's why in The Lion King, as soon as Scar takes over the kingdom, it grows dark and everything is withering and dying and evil. It's that fungal corruption. It is the same thing with the evil forest or the corrupted heroes. And always it is the light or holy light that eradicates the evil force and restores the forest or the land. And think of how many shows at the height of the conflict and the rising action, the evil antagonist is doing his worst. It is always dark and rainy, and stormy and haunting. That light-dark dynamic comes from the relationship of sunlight and fungus, holy and evil. So when you get sick, when you have fungus hacking into your body, possessing and corrupting you, you learn and gain knowledge and creativity. That otherworldly or alien power, you can tap into this. You can try to invoke or summon it. You can pursue it. And it can just happen randomly. The right fungus gets in and slowly takes over your brain. But in between that, you have the knowledge and power of that fungal entity, as well as its madness and sickness. I think if you've grasped some of my previous videos, you'll see how this makes sense with fungi being everywhere, hyper-intelligent, and a force and source of information, sickness, and magic. We could talk about the synchronistic qualities of fungal corruption, the conscious choice to fight it or give in, to embrace it and head into the madness where elucidation and erudition rest, the sixth sense and paranormal sensitivity, the ability to read people inexplicably, to see the future, to feel energy, to learn skills and languages without putting effort. This fungal consciousness is the basis for much of the supernatural, paranormal phenomena in the world. Many people are skeptical of believing in cases of supernatural, metaphysical, and just unexplained cases. Throughout history are such examples of humans who could perform miracles or feats impossible to our understanding. On one hand, it is hard to verify, especially from cases coming from the past. And again, some people have faked it on purpose. And then on the other hand, many people disbelieve because there is no accepted explanation that they can verify. I looked up some cases of humans with so-called superpowers. Prahlad Jani is a Hindu man who claims he doesn't need to eat food since the 1940s. He was observed in a locked room for 10 days and was healthy and fine with no food or water. And actually there are many cases of this ability for people, usually monks or ascetics, who can learn how to never need food or water and live well past 100 years old. Here is a man named Kevin Richardson who is able to communicate with lions. From history, you have Saint Francis of Assisi who could do this. And just in general, many humans can have certain kinds of abilities and connections to animals. This was an alleged role of shamans, dressing as an animal to learn its behavior and attune yourself with nature to befriend the animal. Ben Underwood was the boy who learned how to see with sonar and ultimately died from cancer. There are people who can't sleep and don't need it, people with extreme control over temperature and their bodily functions, photographic memories, eidetic memories, spiritual communication, divinatory powers, water dowsing, seeing through skin or seeing auras and energy fields. People who can't feel pain or can memorize strings of numbers or mathematical equations that not even computers can compete with. In World War II, there was a bizarre case of a Franciscan friar who gained the wound of Christ, and with that ability of healing, prophecy, and reading of minds, as well as this sort of bilocation or astral projection power. Of course, he was gravely sick the entire time, dealing with lung infections and bleeding profusely from those so-called wounds of Christ. And many of these people have different sicknesses, of course. Sometimes it is really evident and slowly kills them. Other times it is contained and muted. They could be perfectly healthy and have these abilities. Maybe they are able to recognize that they don't need to pursue anything more, that they are fine the way they are. Other times, the type of fungus simply is not one that is killing them. Even through corruption, you can maintain your humanity. Very disciplined people are able to do this. I believe this is why many religious, be it Christian, Buddhist, Shaolin, whatever religion it may be, many of these monks and priests who spend their lifetime meditating and focusing on this spiritual enlightenment and dedication, and they end up developing powers. They tap into that fungal connection, that divine relationship. And it's the same for occultists or witches or demonologists or shamans. I think now with context we can begin to consider all these examples and see what they have in common. What is the one constant in all this? It is fungi. Every human from history is exposed to fungi in some way. And some humans have dove headfirst into that connection, others through circumstance. Those Roman emperors who went insane from lead poisoning is not because of the lead itself, it's because heavy metals allow for mold to grow inside you. Fungi seek out those compartments of the body where toxic metal particles are lodged in, and they can grow and spread from that. It's the same reason why mercury poisoning is so harmful as well. They can grow in heavy metal particles in the body. And for the Roman emperors, even someone like Caligula, who is seen as one of the craziest emperors, actually recognized the stupidity of the upper class, and often executed and ridiculed them. He made his advisor a horse, not because he was mentally unstable, because he would rather have a horse than a human working for him. That detachment from worldly things and humanity, when it's in context of sickness and power, is something you can expect from this archetype. All these monsters, vampires, demons, werewolves, and what have you from legend and stories have evolved to be their own things now. But we can see them ticking those tropes and what they ultimately derive from. Take Dracula, the vampire whose hunger for knowledge and science made him hate humanity, and his anger increased his monstrous form. Themes of night and darkness, and the moon are what we expect to see in all these iterations of the witch queen, the parasitic corruption, the sorcerer, and the shaman. The ability and mood of the energies they work with are heightened in the dark, where fungus grows. Now these special abilities, the fungal consciousness and fungal entities, demons and gods, are the beginning. All I can explain is the trend and trope, the archetype of these happenings and circumstances, the observation of that magic, madness, and sadness as it's expressed in female and male forms, the anima and the animus of each individual. There is a level of physiognomic expression that exhibits itself with these people, and possibly a link to certain astrological or astronomical events, along with geographical settings that can indicate and influence the fungal growth that is possible in a person. Intentions and the search of knowledge and power are other avenues in which the fungal consciousness may be obtained. These are intelligent entities and respond to the summoning rituals of occultism and the meditation of enlightenment. These people begin to look different on the metaphysical level. The eyes change, sometimes physical appearances change, as well as the body is just taken over by fungal corruption. But the windows to the soul reflect a consciousness and awareness that we consider to be otherworldly. Fungal world is what it is. Again, the identification of a fungal connection and consciousness with abilities of fungi is where we can start to begin our real research. What fungi is capable of and what this fungal consciousness truly is, and where it leads to is the obvious next step in searching and understanding these supernatural and miraculous phenomena some humans are capable of, even the extreme levels of skill and talent that people develop from the sickness of fungi, both mental and physical, lead to more questions than what is answered. This apartness, isolation, maddening qualities of knowledge, and entering the fungal consciousness makes it difficult to study without delving into that insanity yourself. This is the mainstay of many horror novelists and occultists, the themes of power, truth, and madness. The references I made may not be 100% accurate. This can be a difficult thing to identify, but there are qualities that seem to be unique to this archetype. You could spend hours breaking this down further and going into the psychology and metaphysical properties and the change in form and body in both fiction and real life. It's a lot to take in and consider. I'm going to stop the video here because my computer is already going to struggle to render and upload this, but feel free to voice your own thoughts and experiences and observations in the comments. And just remember to always consider and pay attention to your magic, madness, and sadness. Thanks for watching.
Studying these symptoms could lead me to their underlying cause, and then I'll control the forces that hold sway over Simon.
I see.
You see what?
The coconut crab who swims in your neighbor's pool at night. Maybe Simon's in there too. Who else holds their breath in there, Betty?
All magic users swim in the loomy gloom.